Welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 3. But before we look at Genesis chapter 3, I don't know if you noticed it last time, but I sort of missed one verse in Genesis chapter 2. And that was the very last verse in Genesis 2. You know, Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, things are going along really great. God creates the world and He creates Adam and Eve. He gives them this beautiful place to live with all the animals. And I'm sorry to say that today things are going to go downhill a little bit in Genesis chapter 3. But there's this curious verse that ends Genesis chapter 2. It's verse 25. And I purposefully didn't read it last week because I wanted to start out with that one, because it kind of closes the chapter on this perfect world that God had made. But it's also an interesting verse. So Genesis 2:25, Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. So we can learn a couple of things. It's kind of a curious way to end, Genesis chapter 2. But it kind of says, I think, two important things. One, just on the practical realm, I'm thinking that if they were, running around the garden with no clothes on, the temperature there must have been beautiful. When it gets to be like 90 degrees, I'm ready to put a hat on and, protect from the sun. And if it's 60 degrees, I'm starting to put sweaters on and things. But they were able to just enjoy this place without clothes, which means to me it's got to be somewhere around 80 degrees all the time. Just one more little practical thing to try to imagine, what the Garden of Eden must have been like. Well, okay, so that's one thing. That's not the real important thing, though, because it talks about the fact that, they were naked and not ashamed. And what does it mean to be ashamed? Well, if you do something good, are you ashamed? Of course not. But if you do something bad, of course, that's when you start talking about being ashamed. So it says they were not ashamed. I think that's a real important concept. And I don't know, maybe that was one of the best things about that time in the Garden of Eden, is that there was no shame, because up until that point, they hadn't really done anything wrong. Now remember, we talked about the tree, and we were asking the question, why does God put this tree there and give them the potential for disobedience? Well, we got into this whole thing about free will and truly loving someone because you want to love them, not because you have to love them. And, I think that still stands true. But, well, things, unfortunately, as I said, are about to change. And so what we're going to do is start now in Genesis chapter 3 to see some of these changes that are about to occur. And the theme today, the big question that we're going to ask today in regards to the Christian worldview is, what is evil? Where did evil come from? We talk about the devil, we talk about Satan, and, here we're going to get introduced to him, or I should say he's going to introduce himself to Adam and Eve in these verses today. So let's begin. We'll read the first verse of chapter 3, which kind of sets the groundwork for what's happening. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" I guess there's a couple of things we can see from this, is that he doesn't have any respect for God, and he doesn't have any respect for, these parameters that God had put on Adam and Eve. So he puts this question in Eve's mind. Are you really sure that God said you shouldn't eat from this tree? One of the things another thing we see about Satan is that it seems like he's trying to sneak into this perfect world that God had created. He's trying to infiltrate it and corrupt this relationship that Adam and Eve had with God. And we're going to be looking at Satan and where he came from, and try to learn a little bit about the way he thinks and what, his underlying motives are. but we're starting to get a sense of who he is already. The next verse, next couple of verses, Genesis 3:2-3, the woman said to the serpent, this is Eve's response, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." So it's interesting here. Now, Eve knew exactly what God's commands was, because he recites it here. I think in this case, the real question is going to be, how does she respond to this, I guess you could call it like a temptation from the devil, to ask this question. Is she going to question God? How is she going to respond? Is she going to stay in obedience to God, or is she starting to think over, I wonder what would happen if I did eat from this tree? Well, this is another thing we learned about Satan, and maybe that's why, the sly snake is why he chose to appear that way. So now we continue on, Genesis 3:4-5. Here's Satan's response. "You will not certainly die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So now things are getting more interesting. And basically Satan makes three statements. Two of them are not true. One of them is sort of true. And it's an interesting thing about the way Satan works, because sometimes he will take something that's true and then just twist it around a little bit to throw you off track. But the first thing he says is in direct contradiction to what God said. "Certainly you will not die." Well, Satan is demonstrating and showing really who he is. He is in opposition to God. And then he says, and the next thing he says is that your eyes will be open. Now, there's an element of truth to that. And that's exactly what they found out when they did eat the fruit, because their eyes were open. They were able to discern the difference between good and evil. And the third thing he says, "and you will be like God." Well, now that's another total lie. But when Eve heard him say that, I think she was thinking maybe something a little beyond just knowing good and evil. And this is kind of interesting because it seems to be a human tendency, this idea of, man, wouldn't it be cool to be like God? Maybe that's why we invent things like Superman, superpowers, and that we can elevate ourselves to a higher plane of power. I don't know, but I think you see a lot of examples of that in world history, of people who wanted to be like God. And really, Satan he doesn't change his mode of operation, and he hasn't ever, and he probably never will. Trying to promise people, make this whisper in their ears and say, you can be like God. We think of somebody like the Caesars in Rome at the time of Christ, and they insisted upon being worshipped as if they were a god. That's why they didn't like Christianity, because you had these Christians that were bowing down before this true God, and Caesar didn't get along so well with that notion because he thought they should be worshiping him. And this is something you see throughout history. You see people that have this God complex. The Emperor Hirohito in World War II. It's not just ancient history, it's recent history as well. But the Japanese people at that time worshipped him. And you have guys like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Now, I don't know if he thinks he's God or not, but he sure makes people treat him that way. His word is the final word on everything. Anyway, you see this tendency in human nature, and we see it just demonstrated throughout history. This idea that we can be like God. Really, that's kind of what humanism is all about. If you remember, we talked a little bit about that. It's like we are the highest form of creation, and so in a sense, we are our own gods. This is, not uncommon for people to think that way. But in order to really understand who Satan is, I mean, if we want to get if you wanted to write the the biography of Satan, you need to get some background material on him, and you're not getting that here in the book of Genesis. So you got to go to some other places in the Bible to find out, to learn a little bit more about exactly who Satan is. And there's a few things that we need to know about him. One thing we already know is that he's a liar. And here are the words of Jesus. This is what Jesus says about Satan, how he describes him. He was a murderer from the beginning. This is from John 8:44. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth. For there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language. For he is a liar and the father of lies. So Jesus saw that about Satan. And that's how he describes Satan, as being the father of lies. And, you know, the very first thing he does, steps into this earth and tells these huge whoppers of a lie to Adam and Eve. But there's another thing that maybe you don't realize about him. You know, where did he come from? Where did he get his start? Well, he was actually created as a perfect angel. That doesn't seem to, to kind of fit his current reputation, but the Bible tells us that that's where he got his start. He was created as a perfect angelic being. And to get that, we go to the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a prophet in the Old Testament. Ezekiel chapter 28, because he says some things about Satan that we can learn from. One, in Ezekiel 28:11, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Man, you don't think of Satan as being beautiful, but he was in his original created form. A few verses later, in verses 14 and 15, you were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created. You know, this term, guardian cherub, that means that Satan wasn't just an average angel, but he was higher up in the ranks of angels, and he was very close to God. And so that makes, his rebellion a little more hard to believe. But at the same time, being so high up and, feeling so good about himself, boastful and prideful, this is why he decided he should be elevated to the position of God. And that's the next thing that we learn about him, is that he wanted to be equal with God. So you're starting to get a picture of who Satan is, and I think it's important to get this background so that we can understand who our enemy, and indeed he is our enemy, who he is. So Ezekiel, again in Ezekiel 28:17, your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. And then another verse in Isaiah says something similar. This is another picture of Satan from the prophet Isaiah. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of the assembly. So you see, Satan is perceiving himself to be equal with God, and would like to be treated that way. But because of his pride, and because, that's just not going to work, he ends up being cast out of heaven. And that's another thing that we need to know about him. Revelation, this is, last book in the Bible. You can find Satan throughout the whole Bible because he shows up everywhere, because he's involved in pretty much everything against what God is doing. But Revelation 12:9 says the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled down to earth, and his angels with him. And so what is Satan doing right now? Well, he's described as leading the whole world astray. And this is after he was cast out of heaven. And he began there in the Garden of Eden. The very first thing he did was to sneak in that garden and to work on the very first human beings to corrupt them. And he was unfortunately successful in persuading them to act in disobedience to God. But another thing we should know, and the Bible tells us in another place, that during this rebellion in heaven, 1/3 of all the angels in heaven followed Satan. So Satan was leading this rebellion, and he wasn't the only one involved in it. So 1/3 of all the angels in heaven followed him. And of course now, the Bible is full of references to demons and all of these followers of Satan, these angelic beings who had fallen out of grace and had fallen from heaven and were in rebellion against God. This gives us an understanding of this whole spiritual world that we have going on around us. And this is a big part of our Christian worldview, that if you are a Christian and you believe in what the Bible says, this is the way you explain evil. And, it's a good explanation because it's true. So you have this huge rebellion in heaven. And another thing we learn about Satan is that it's his nature not to build, but to destroy. God's nature was to create and to build. Satan's nature is to destroy. And one of the apostles, the apostle Peter, in the New Testament saw this because he was busy building the church, and he was concerned about the believers that he was ministering to, and he could see how Satan was trying to creep in and send them off in the wrong direction. So this is what Peter says about Satan. He says, be alert. He's warning his fellow Christians. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. So we need to really see Satan as our enemy. This is a spiritual battle, and there's a lot of places in the Bible that make reference to that fact, that we are caught up in the spiritual battle. Another thing we need to know about Satan is that everything he does is, I guess you could say, the opposite, or like a negative image of God. We are created in the image of God. Satan would like to take that image of God away from us and make us act more like he does. This great rebellion, his goal is really to try to get us to rebel against God in the same way. And you'll remember when we were talking about this issue, do you believe in God or not? And we had these different categories of people. Yeah, there are people who follow God, who read the Bible and believe it. There are people who aren't quite so sure, the agnostic. But there are people who actually live their lives in rebellion against God, knowing that there is a God, but rebelling against him. And in that sense, this rebellion that began in heaven really did come down into this earth. It permeated this earth. And we can see that same rebellion in the hearts of many people around us. So I think it's important for us to be sober and of sound mind, be alert, because the devil is like a roaring lion seeking who he can devour. But he is also, as I said, against Christ. And there's a term that's used in the Bible, another term that's used to describe Satan as being the anti-Christ, the negative image of who Christ is. And everything that he does really is against Christ from the very beginning. And, God creates us, and he has this perfect relationship with us. We disobey and we get out of touch with God. And from the very beginning, and next week we're going to actually look at a verse that tells us that God has a plan to restore us to him. This is the very first mention of a plan, and it's way back there in Genesis chapter 3, which we'll be looking at next week. But Satan has been trying to disrupt that plan, and everything that God does, he tries to tear down. He tries to destroy what Christ is building. And so this term Antichrist comes into play. And we learned in the book of Revelation that there will actually be a man in the future that comes in the last days who will be so full of Satan, and he will be a representative of Satan, and he will be called the Antichrist, and he will try to carry out Satan's dream of ruling the world, but he'll do so in an evil and wicked way. It's going to be a while before we get to the book of Revelation, so you might want to do a little research on this Antichrist person. But the spirit of the Antichrist is seen many, many times in many people and has been throughout history. We think of people like Mussolini and Stalin and Hitler and the countless millions of Christians that were killed because they were following this pattern of the Antichrist. This Antichrist who hates the children of God. I think it's important for us to understand that we do have an enemy. And for that reason, that's why Peter was telling the church to be alert and to be sober, to be aware of this enemy that we all have. But there is good news, and the good news is that his time is limited. We can read one more verse in Revelation chapter 12, another verse in Revelation, and verse 10. It says, "Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, 'Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah.'" This is something that's going to happen when Jesus comes back. "For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down." Now, this accuser that this is talking about is Satan, and that's another, I guess you could say, dimension to what he tries to do. He will try to convince people that they can never have a relationship with God because they are sinful. Now, the Bible makes it clear that we're all sinful. But, if you do something wrong, maybe just like Adam and Eve were hiding from God because they knew they did something wrong. We're going to read about that next week. You have this guilty feeling, and it puts this wall between you and God. And the more you go in that direction away from God, and the more you live a life of disobedience, the more impossible it seems to you that you could come back into God's presence. Satan wants you to believe that. And he's going to be the first one to point his finger at you and say, "Look at you, you're not perfect. God doesn't want to have anything to do with you." But that's not true. Because when Jesus comes back, he's coming back to take those of us who believe in him and have accepted his forgiveness. He's not going to take people because we've lived a perfect life, because that ain't going to happen to anybody, no matter what. But he's coming back because of his, and allowing us to reestablish our relationship with him simply because he loves us and he has forgiven us. And that's the last thing that Satan wants us to know. And so he's going to just keep pounding away and try to convince us, that we are not worthy of God. Well, truly, we are not worthy to be in God's presence. But what Satan doesn't want us to know is that God is merciful and that God is restoring our relationship to him because of his mercy and because of what he did on the cross. So this is important, and I think it's important when we think about our Christian worldview to try to understand evil. There's a lot of ways that people explain evil. Different religions, have all these different ideas. But I think once you understand where Satan came from and who he is now and what he's trying to do in this earth, it makes it a lot easier to understand the things that are going on around about us. So this is where we're going to end today. I've got one good word. This is a really good word when we're thinking about Satan and, you know, all the power that he has and all the bad stuff that he does. But this is a verse that we find in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 4. And he's trying to encourage the people that he's writing to. You, dear children, are from God and have overcome them. That is the evil in the world. Because the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. And, you know, if you try to do a one-on-one against Satan, you will lose every time. Because we don't have the power to fight against him. But God does. And we have to understand, too, that God is there restraining Satan. He keeps him from doing what he would like to do, which is to basically destroy everything. And so we live in this world where it's kind of a balance, and God is keeping Satan under control, and there's going to come a day when he will lock him away and throw away the key. And we certainly do look forward to that day. But maybe a good way to picture it is to think of like Noah in the ark, where God gave him this protected vessel in which he could live and survive, you know, all the turmoil and the storms and the floods that were going on around him. And this is how God holds us in his hands. Yeah, you can't fight Satan yourself. You don't have the power to. But God is, you know, there's this verse, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And that's exactly what God wants to do. So I hope that this has been, I don't know, it's kind of a downer, you know, well, all of a sudden this perfect world gets defiled by sin. But it's also something that's real, and it's something we see all around us. And, you know, knowing this really does help us to deal and to explain with the things that we see. So, homework next time. We'll continue on. We did the first 5 verses here of Genesis 3, so you can continue on. And in the meantime, know that I'm thinking about you guys and praying for you, and I hope you will join us next time.